Long before marble temples rise above Athens, before Homeric kings are given names, before Greece becomes a word that means anything close to what it means today, the Aegean is already alive with movement. From a distance, it looks like a broken landscape, a sea scattered with islands, narrow channels, hidden coves, steep hills, and shorelines that seem to splinter endlessly into one another. To early communities, this geography is both obstacle and opportunity. Mountains divide people on land, but the sea connects them. A boat can cross distances that would take days overland. An island visible on the horizon becomes not an edge of the known world, but the next point in a chain. The Aegean of prehistory is not one civilization, it is a mosaic. Small farming settlements occupy fertile valleys and sheltered plains. Fishing communities live near coves where boats can be pulled above the tide. Shepherds move flocks through rocky uplands. Potters shape local clays into vessels that carry food, oil, grain, and drink. Stoneworkers search for materials that cannot be found everywhere, and this search begins to bind distant communities together. One of the most revealing materials is obsidian, the dark volcanic glass that fractures into razor-sharp edges. On the island of Melos, rich deposits become valuable centuries before bronze weapons, palaces, or writing appear. Obsidian from Melos travels far beyond the island itself, appearing at prehistoric sites across the Aegean and even beyond. That trade tells a quiet but important story. People are already crossing open water with purpose. They know seasonal winds, currents, coastlines, and landmarks. They understand which harbours are safe and which shores offer fresh water. Their boats leave almost no archaeological trace because wood and fibre rarely survive. Yet the stone they transport survives in abundance. The sea, in other words, preserves evidence of travel without preserving the vessels that made travel possible. Scholars still debate the exact nature of the earliest Aegean boats, but the distribution of materials leaves little doubt that maritime knowledge is already sophisticated. By the Neolithic period, beginning in parts of the Aegean many thousands of years before the great Bronze Age palaces, agriculture has transformed daily life. Domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle become central to survival. Villages are more permanent. Houses are rebuilt repeatedly on the same ground. Storage becomes increasingly important because grain harvested once must last through months when fields are bare. The rhythm of life begins to depend not only on hunting, gathering an immediate opportunity, but on planning. A failed harvest can become a crisis. A full storeroom can become power. This is one of the slow changes that eventually makes kingdoms possible. Authority does not suddenly appear when the first palace is built. It grows out of long habits of cooperation, competition, storage, exchange, inheritance, ritual, and control over desirable resources. A village that possesses better farmland has advantages. A household with more animals can endure bad seasons. A community located near a harbour can receive goods from across the sea over generations. Inequality can become visible in architecture, burials, and access to rare objects. The sea itself encourages specialization. Many islands cannot produce everything their inhabitants need. Some lack sufficient timber. Others have limited arable land. Certain metals occur only in particular regions. This forces communities to look outward. Copper must travel. Tin, needed later for true bronze, must often travel much farther. Fine stone, shell, pigments, and prestige goods move from one place to another. the Aegean gradually becomes a web of dependence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. By the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, that web is becoming denser. The early Bronze Age brings new technologies and new social patterns. Metal tools become more common, though stone never disappears. Settlements expand in some regions. Fortifications appear at certain sites, suggesting that wealth creates reasons for both protection and attack. Larger houses may belong to families with greater influence. Communal buildings hint at organization beyond the household. Burial customs grow more elaborate in some communities, and imported objects appear far from where they were made. Yet there is no single capital and no unified Aegean state. The political map would have been fractured into dozens, perhaps hundreds, of local territories whose exact boundaries are impossible to reconstruct. Some may be little more than villages with surrounding farmland. Others may control harbours or networks of smaller settlements. Leadership could rest with families, councils, ritual specialists, warrior elites, or combinations that leave only faint archaeological traces. The evidence remains incomplete because political institutions do not fossilize. Archaeologists infer them from buildings, storage capacity, weapons, seals, burials, and patterns of exchange. One surprising feature of this early world is how quickly distant places begin to resemble one another without becoming identical. Pottery styles spread, metalworking techniques circulate, certain burial practices appear across wide areas, objects imitate foreign forms. A vessel made on one island may copy a shape first seen hundreds of kilometers away. These similarities suggest that people are not simply trading commodities. They are watching one another, borrowing ideas, and learning what symbols signal status. The islands of the Cyclades are especially important in this process. Their position in the centre of the Aegean turns them into stepping stones between mainland Greece, Crete, and the Anatolian coast. Islands that seem isolated on a modern map may in fact sit directly along prehistoric routes. Sailors moving by daylight can often see one island from another. This matters in a world without compasses, charts, or mechanical navigation. The horizon itself becomes a guide. Conditions are still dangerous. Sudden winds can make narrow passages treacherous. Rocky coasts offer few places to land. Boats overloaded with pottery or stone can be lost in minutes, yet risk does not stop travel. It may even encourage the growth of communities that possess specialized knowledge of the sea. Navigators who know when to depart, where to shelter, and how to read clouds would have been enormously valuable. At the same time, the Aegean sits between larger cultural zones. To the east lie Anatolia and, farther beyond, the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Levant. To the south lies Egypt. To the west stretch the central Mediterranean and Italy. The Aegean is not yet politically dominant, but its position is extraordinary. It occupies a maritime crossroads through which materials, technologies, and stories can move. The first kingdoms will emerge from this geography not by escaping its fragmentation, but by mastering it. Crete will exploit its fertile plains and strategic position. Mainland rulers will turn fortified citadels into centers of power. Island communities will become intermediaries in long-distance exchange. For centuries, their fortunes will rise and fall according to something deceptively simple: who can control movement across the sea. And before the palaces, before the great citadels and storerooms, before writing records, livestock, and offerings, the clearest signs of this emerging world appear on islands of marble, wind, and stone, where communities begin to create some of the most haunting objects ever recovered from prehistoric Europe. Across the central Aegean, the islands of the Cyclades rise from the sea like fragments of pale stone. Many are dry, windswept, and mountainous, with thin soils and limited fresh water. At first glance, they do not seem like the obvious places for complex communities to flourish. Yet during the 3rd millennium BCE, these islands become the centre of one of the most distinctive cultures of the early Bronze Age. Their inhabitants live in small settlements, cultivate grain and vines where the land allows, keep sheep and goats on rocky slopes, fish the surrounding waters, quarry stone, and travel constantly between islands. The sea that appears to divide them instead becomes the framework of their world. The Cycladic communities are not united under a single ruler. There is no known Cycladic kingdom stretching across the islands, no palace bureaucracy, and no surviving written archive. What emerges instead is a network of communities that share certain artistic styles, burial customs, technologies, and maritime connections. Archaeologists identify regional variations within this broad cultural sphere, and scholars still debate how closely individual islands were politically or socially connected. What survives in the record suggests interaction rather than uniformity, a world in which communities borrow from one another while maintaining local identities. Their most famous creations are carved from marble. The islands contain abundant deposits of fine white stone, especially on places such as Naxos and Paros, and Cycladic craftspeople shape it into bowls, vessels, and remarkable human figures. Many of these figurines depict standing forms with arms folded across the torso, elongated heads, narrow noses, and simplified bodies. To modern eyes they can seem astonishingly abstract, almost contemporary in appearance, but this impression is misleading. Their makers are not pursuing modern artistic minimalism. These objects belong to a cultural language that is now largely lost. Most surviving examples have been recovered from graves, which strongly suggests a connection with funerary practice, identity, belief, memory, or status. Yet their precise meaning remains uncertain. Some may represent the dead, ancestors, protective beings, deities, attendants, or symbolic human forms. No single explanation fully accounts for the range of figures, their sizes, their contexts, and the traces of repeated use found on some examples. A number were repaired in antiquity, indicating that they could remain meaningful long enough to justify careful restoration rather than immediate burial. Their appearance today is also deceptive. The familiar white marble surfaces were not necessarily intended to remain bare. Microscopic traces show that many figurines once carried painted details: eyes, hair, facial markings, jewellery, and other features may have been added using pigments that have mostly vanished. Some figures may therefore have looked dramatically different when they were new, their pale stone enlivened by red, blue, or black decoration. The blank faces that now seem mysterious may owe much of their mystery to the simple fact that time erased the paint. The graves containing these objects vary considerably. Some are modest stone-lined burials, others contain pottery, tools, weapons, ornaments, or multiple bodies. Cemeteries can reveal distinctions in wealth, but interpreting status from grave goods alone is difficult. A rich burial does not automatically prove the existence of a hereditary aristocracy, and objects placed with the dead may reflect ritual obligations rather than everyday ownership. Even so, The growing circulation of rare materials and carefully made prestige objects suggests that social differences are becoming increasingly visible. Some settlements offer stronger evidence of competition. At sites such as Castri on Syros, fortifications appear, indicating that defense has become a concern. Walls do not reveal who the enemy is. Violence may come from neighboring communities, raiders arriving by sea, or local struggles intensified by access to trade routes and resources. The presence of weapons, including daggers, also reminds us that the elegant marble figurines represent only one side of Cycladic life. This is a maritime world of beauty and exchange, but it is not necessarily peaceful. Seafaring lies behind almost everything. Copper arrives from outside many islands. Obsidian continues to circulate from Melos. Pottery moves between communities. Metalworking styles show links with mainland Greece, Crete, and western Anatolia. Boats may carry not only goods but craftspeople, marriage partners, religious practices, and political alliances. The exact vessels remain uncertain because organic materials rarely survive. Yet artistic depictions provide tantalizing clues. A famous group of decorated frying pan-shaped objects from the Cyclades includes images interpreted as long boats propelled by many paddlers. Their exact function is still debated, but the maritime symbolism is unmistakable. These vessels hint at organized crews. A boat requiring perhaps 20 or more paddlers is not simply a fisherman's canoe. It represents coordination, labor, and planning. Such craft could move people and cargo across substantial distances when weather permitted. They could also carry armed groups. The same technology that connects islands can expose them to attack, creating a tension that will remain central throughout Aegean history. The sea makes prosperity possible, but it also makes isolation impossible. One lesser-known clue to the scale of these connections comes from the movement of marble itself. Scientific analysis can sometimes identify the geological source of stone used in individual objects. Figurines found on one island may have been carved from marble quarried on another, revealing networks hidden behind their finished forms. The object in a grave therefore contains the memory of a journey stone extracted from one landscape, carved perhaps elsewhere, carried by boat, handled in life, and eventually placed with the dead. During the later 3rd millennium BCE, the distinctive early Cycladic world begins to change. Settlement patterns shift. Some sites are abandoned or reorganized. Fortifications become more prominent in certain areas. Cultural influences from neighboring regions intensify, particularly from Anatolia and later from Crete. Archaeologists once tried to explain these transformations through simple invasion models, but the evidence is more complicated. Migration may have played a role, yet trade, local conflict, demographic change, technological adaptation, and shifting power networks can produce similar archaeological patterns. The Cyclades are not erased. Their communities continue, but the balance of power within the Aegean begins to move. Far to the south, Crete possesses something most of the smaller islands cannot match: broad agricultural zones, large populations, substantial resources, and a position commanding routes between the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. During the centuries that follow, those advantages allow Cretan communities to expand beyond the scale of village networks. Monumental buildings rise, storage becomes centralized, administration grows more complicated, foreign contacts multiply. The island world of the Cyclades has already demonstrated what maritime connectivity can create. Crete is about to take that principle and transform it into something far larger, more organized, and more mysterious. the first great palace civilization of the Aegean. Crete rises from the southern Aegean as a long, mountainous island standing between several worlds. To the north lie the Cyclades and mainland Greece. To the east stretch the islands and coasts leading toward Anatolia and the Levant. Egypt lies across the sea to the south. The island is large enough to contain fertile plains, upland pastures, forests, harbours, and communities separated by rugged mountain ranges, yet connected strongly enough that ideas and goods can circulate across it. By the beginning of the second millennium BCE, this combination of size, resources, and maritime position helps produce a transformation unlike anything the Aegean has yet seen. At places such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia, large architectural complexes begin to dominate the landscape. They are traditionally called palaces, although the word can be misleading. These are not simply royal residences in the later European sense. They contain magazines for storage, workshops, ceremonial courts, administrative rooms, staircases, corridors, shrines, reception spaces, and areas whose functions remain uncertain. Some buildings expand through multiple phases, creating complicated arrangements that later visitors would find almost labyrinthine. Their scale reveals something new. Large quantities of labour and agricultural surplus can now be organised around central institutions. The societies that build them are today called Minoan, a modern archaeological name derived from the mythical king Minos. The people themselves almost certainly did not use that label. We do not know what they called their island, their political communities, or even whether they considered themselves part of one unified cultural identity. The evidence remains incomplete because their principal written language, preserved in the script known as Linear A, has not been convincingly deciphered. Archaeology therefore has to reconstruct much of their world from buildings, pottery, seals, frescoes, tools, graves, religious objects, and the patterns left behind by storage and trade. The earliest palace complexes appear around 1900 BCE, though their development grows out of centuries of increasing social complexity. There is no single moment when villages suddenly become states. Instead, settlements become larger. Elite families gain influence. Craft production becomes more specialized, and the movement of goods becomes increasingly organized. Agricultural produce is gathered and stored in enormous quantities. At Knossos, long magazines contain rows of large storage jars known as pithoi, some tall enough to reach a person's chest or higher. These containers can hold grain, oil, wine, and other valuable products, turning stored food into something that can support workers, ceremonies, exchange, and political authority. Control over storage matters because Crete's economy depends on seasonal cycles. Olive oil and wine can be stored and transported. Wool can be transformed into textiles. Grain can support populations beyond the immediate farming household. A central institution capable of collecting, recording, and redistributing these resources gains enormous influence. Yet scholars still debate exactly how palace authority functions. Older interpretations imagined powerful kings ruling centralized territories. More recent approaches often emphasize networks of competing elites, religious institutions, local communities, and multiple centers of power. No single model explains every palace or every period of Minoan history. The buildings themselves reveal both organization and spectacle. Many are constructed around large central courts, spaces that may host ceremonies, gatherings, or performances. Light wells bring daylight deep into complex interiors. Wooden columns taper downward rather than upward, creating a distinctive architectural form visible in later reconstructions. Walls are coated with plaster and sometimes decorated with vivid frescoes. Drainage systems manage water through channels and pipes, and certain areas contain installations that suggest surprisingly sophisticated control of runoff and waste. None of this means life is comfortable for everyone. Monumental architecture requires labour. Fields must be cultivated, animals tended, timber cut, stone quarried, clay shaped, goods transported, and storerooms filled. The graceful images preserved in palace art can obscure the physical effort beneath them. For every painted procession or elegantly decorated vessel, there are farmers harvesting under the Cretan sun, and labourers carrying heavy loads into storage rooms. Still, the palaces become more than warehouses. They are places where authority is made visible. Seals and seal impressions reveal administrative control over containers, doors, and documents. Small clay tablets and nodules record transactions. Specialized workshops produce fine pottery, metal goods, stone vessels, and luxury objects. Religious symbolism appears repeatedly, including horns, double axes, sacred trees, mountain sanctuaries, and figures interpreted as worshippers or divine beings. Yet reconstructing belief from imagery is dangerous. The same symbol can carry multiple meanings, and without readable texts, modern categories such as priest, god, king, or temple cannot always be applied confidently. Crete is also looking outward. Minoan-style objects appear across the Aegean, while foreign materials reach Cretan centres. Egyptian scarabs and imported stones testify to southern contacts. Ivory and precious materials arrive from farther east. Cretan pottery travels widely, sometimes becoming prestigious enough to inspire local imitation. Ships departing from northern and eastern Cretan harbours connect the island to the Cyclades, the Greek mainland, Anatolia, Cyprus, and beyond. This growing maritime reach has sometimes encouraged the idea of a Minoan naval empire, a peaceful thalassocracy controlling the Aegean through ships. Ancient Greek writers living many centuries later describe Minos as a ruler of the sea, and archaeologists once used these traditions to imagine widespread political domination by Crete. The archaeological evidence is more cautious. Minoan cultural influence is undeniable in many places, but influence does not automatically equal direct rule. Trade, marriage, migration, imitation, and local alliances can spread styles without requiring conquest. Scholars still debate how much political control Crete exercises beyond its shores. A lesser-known clue comes from the distribution of administrative practices. Minoan sealings and writing systems appear at sites beyond Crete, suggesting that administrative methods themselves travel along with goods. In some regions, local elites seem to adopt Cretan symbols because association with Crete carries prestige. This is a subtle form of power. A successful civilization does not always need to occupy another place militarily if its objects, rituals, and styles become desirable enough to reshape how other elites present themselves. The palace centres also survive disasters. Around the 18th century BCE, many early palaces are destroyed or heavily damaged, possibly by earthquakes, fires, or combinations of local events. They are rebuilt, often on an even grander scale. This resilience is important. It reveals institutions capable of recovering from catastrophe rather than collapsing permanently. The rebuilt palaces become more elaborate, and the period that follows represents the height of Minoan cultural achievement. By then, Crete has become the most powerful and visually distinctive society in the Aegean. Its walls glow with painted processions, animals, plants, and ceremonial scenes. Its storerooms hold agricultural wealth. Its scribes record information in a language that still refuses to reveal itself. Its ships move through a sea already crowded with merchants, travellers, craftsmen, and rivals. The kingdom behind these palaces remains partly hidden from modern eyes. But the material world it creates is anything but silent. Inside the great Cretan palace centres, power is not expressed through a single monumental throne room or an obvious line of defensive walls. It is woven into movement. Corridors narrow and widen. Staircases descend toward storerooms and climb toward open terraces. Courtyards gather people into shared spaces, while smaller chambers restrict access. Light enters through wells cut deep into the buildings, illuminating painted plaster, polished stone, wooden columns, and doorways that could be opened or closed to transform how rooms connect. At Knossos especially, the architecture seems almost restless, constantly redirecting anyone moving through it. The effect is one reason later generations found it easy to imagine a labyrinth here, though the archaeological complex belongs to history rather than the monster-filled maze of Greek mythology. The walls reveal a society that chooses to represent itself in striking ways. Frescoes show processions, plants, dolphins, birds, landscapes, richly dressed figures, and dangerous athletic scenes involving bulls. Much of what survives is fragmentary, and modern restorations can make some images appear more complete than the ancient remains actually are. Even so, the surviving pieces preserve a visual world unusually interested in movement and nature. Human bodies are often shown with narrow waists, elaborate clothing, carefully arranged hair and jewellery. Animals leap or twist across painted surfaces. Flowers and reeds fill spaces that might elsewhere have been reserved for rulers or battles. One of the most famous themes is bull leaping. Frescoes depict figures interacting with a charging bull in what appears to be an athletic or ceremonial performance. Precisely how such an event works remains uncertain. Some reconstructions imagine an athlete grabbing the horns and somersaulting over the animal's back, while others argue that the painted scenes are symbolic, stylized, or combine several moments into one image. Scholars still debate whether bull leaping is a regularly staged sport, a dangerous ritual, an elite spectacle, or some mixture of all three. Whatever its exact form, the bull clearly carries enormous cultural weight. Religion seems to penetrate many levels of Minoan society, but reconstructing it is difficult because the written language remains unreadable. Peak sanctuaries appear on mountain summits and ridges, sometimes far above settlements. Worshippers travel upward carrying small offerings, including clay figurines shaped like people, animals, or individual body parts. These objects may represent prayers for health, fertility, protection, or gratitude. Elsewhere, caves become sacred places. Within palace complexes, smaller shrines contain vessels, figurines, offering tables, and symbols such as the double axe. The double axe, often called the lebri, becomes one of the best-known Minoan symbols, but its exact meaning is unclear. It appears in religious contexts and sometimes in monumental form. The so-called horns of consecration, shaped like stylized bovine horns, are another recurring emblem. Sacred trees and pillars may also play important roles. Modern interpretations have sometimes tried to combine all these signs into a single coherent religion, dominated by one great goddess. but the evidence does not require such simplicity. Minoan belief may involve multiple divine beings, local cults, ancestor traditions, nature symbolism, and ceremonies whose meanings change over time. The people performing these rituals are not necessarily separate from political authority. In societies without clear boundaries between religion, administration, and rulership, controlling ceremonies can be another way of controlling resources and legitimacy. Yet there is persistent mystery at the center of Minoan political life. Rulers are difficult to identify. Egypt displays pharaohs on a monumental scale. Mesopotamian kings leave inscriptions celebrating victories and divine favor. Crete offers nothing so straightforward. A figure seated on a throne appears in the famous throne room at Knossos. But whether the occupant is a king, priest, priestess, or ceremonial representative cannot be established with confidence. This absence may be meaningful, or it may simply reflect the accident of preservation. Perhaps Minoan rulers deliberately present authority through ritual rather than individual portraiture. Perhaps political leadership is distributed among elite groups. Perhaps images of rulers existed in forms that have not survived. What survives in the record suggests hierarchy, administration, and unequal access to wealth, but not a political system modern scholars can describe with certainty. Economic life leaves clearer traces. Storerooms filled with pithoi indicate large-scale collection and management of agricultural produce. Workshops associated with palatial centres manufacture pottery, textiles, metalwork, carved stone, and luxury objects. Skilled craftspeople produce delicate cups, elaborate seals, bronze tools, weapons, jewellery, and vessels carved from hard stones that demand considerable technical ability. Fine pottery develops increasingly complex shapes and painted decoration, including the famous marine style, where octopuses and other sea creatures seem to spread across vessels as though the surface itself were underwater. Textile production is especially important, even though cloth rarely survives. Loom weights, spindle whirls, administrative records from later contexts, and comparative evidence reveal how much labor is invested in spinning and weaving. Wool must be gathered, cleaned, spun, dyed, and woven. A palace able to organize large textile industries controls a commodity that can be traded widely and displayed as a marker of status. The vivid costumes of Minoan art, with patterned skirts, fitted garments, and elaborate accessories, hint at the cultural importance of clothing beyond simple necessity. Imported materials reinforce the scale of these connections. Ivory probably arrives from Africa or the Near East. Precious stones come from distant regions. Copper reaches Crete through trade networks extending towards Cyprus and elsewhere. Gold, silver, glassy materials, exotic shells, and carved luxury goods enter elite circulation. In return, Cretan pottery and manufactured objects travel abroad. Egyptian tomb paintings even depict foreign emissaries carrying Aegean-style vessels. Though identifying every painted figure with a precise ethnic or political group remains difficult. Behind this movement of goods stands administration, and here the silence of Linear A becomes particularly frustrating. Hundreds of inscriptions survive on clay tablets, ceilings, vessels, and ritual objects. The script can be read phonetically only in a limited sense because some signs later appear in Linear B, but the underlying language has not been securely identified. Scholars can recognize numerical systems, commodities, and recurring patterns, yet the full statements remain beyond reach. There have been many proposed decipherments, but none has achieved broad scholarly acceptance. This means a palace storeroom can preserve the containers, ceilings, tablets, and architecture of an administrative system while withholding the thoughts of the people who operate it. Their scribes are visible through their handwriting, their accounting habits, and the clay they press with styluses, but not through readable sentences. It is one of the strangest contrasts in Aegean archaeology. A civilization can appear richly before the eye while remaining almost voiceless. And nowhere is that contrast more vivid than on another island north of Crete, where a Bronze Age town will survive not because it escapes disaster, but because disaster seals it beneath volcanic ash. North of Crete, near the southern edge of the Cyclades, the island of Thera curves around a flooded volcanic basin. Today it is better known as Santorini, famous for white settlements clinging to cliffs above a deep blue sea. But beneath the modern landscape lies evidence of a very different island, and near its southern coast sits one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites anywhere in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Akrotiri survives because an eruption buried it. Walls that might otherwise have collapsed into anonymous rubble remain standing. Rooms still preserve storage jars, staircases, doorways, plaster, furniture impressions, and painted scenes. It is sometimes compared with Pompeii, but Akrotiri is far older, and what makes it important is not only how suddenly it disappeared, it is how much of an Aegean town it reveals. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, Akrotiri is no isolated village on a barren volcanic island. It is part of an active maritime world linked to Crete, the Cyclades, mainland Greece, and regions farther east. Its inhabitants build multi-story houses from stone, mud brick, and timber. Some structures contain elaborate wall paintings, broad windows, drainage systems, paved streets, storage rooms, and specialized spaces that suggest considerable wealth and organization. The settlement grows through centuries of rebuilding, which means the town frozen beneath volcanic material is only the final phase of a much longer history. Walking through its excavated streets today, the first surprise is scale. Buildings crowd closely together along narrow lanes. Walls meet at irregular angles shaped by older structures beneath them. Upper floors, now partly lost, once made these streets feel much more enclosed than the open excavation suggests. Doorways connect rooms in complex sequences. Wooden beams strengthen masonry against earthquakes. Stone staircases rise through houses whose occupants clearly expect to live above ground level. This is not monumental palace architecture. It is something rarer in Bronze Age archaeology, a preserved urban neighborhood. The town also possesses a sophisticated drainage system. Channels run beneath streets and buildings, carrying wastewater away from domestic spaces. Certain upper floor installations appear to have been connected to vertical clay pipes. Scholars debate exactly how individual facilities functioned, but the overall system shows deliberate investment in managing water and waste within a dense settlement. It is one of those details easily overshadowed by the famous frescoes. Yet it brings Akrotiri closer to ordinary life. Ancient households have to solve the same basic problems as later towns: where water comes from, where waste goes, and how many people can occupy a small area without making it unlivable. Then there are the paintings. Entire rooms were decorated with scenes so vivid that they transform understanding of the prehistoric Aegean. Monkeys climb through rocky landscapes. Antelopes face one another against pale backgrounds. Women gather saffron from crocus flowers. Young figures participate in activities whose precise meanings remain uncertain. Ships move between coastal settlements in one of the most celebrated compositions, the so-called flotilla fresco. Its long vessels carry crews beneath awnings and pass through a landscape of towns, hills, animals, and water. The scene is tempting to read as a documentary snapshot, but caution is necessary. Bronze Age painters are not photographers. Landscapes may be idealized, symbolic, compressed, or assembled from different real places. The flotilla could represent travel, ceremony, military display, festival, myth, or some combination of these. Scholars still debate the identities of the settlements and the meaning of the journey. Even so, the fresco provides rare evidence for how Aegean people imagine maritime movement. Ships are not peripheral objects. They occupy the center of the composition, connecting communities across the water. Akrotiri's prosperity depends heavily on such connections. Imported pottery and materials reveal contact with Crete and other islands, while locally produced goods circulate outward. The town may occupy an especially useful position along routes between Crete and the central Aegean. Its inhabitants appear deeply influenced by Minoan culture, but Akrotiri is not simply a Cretan colony. Local traditions remain strong, and its artistic style develops distinctive features. This mixture illustrates the complexity of Aegean cultural influence. Similarities can arise through trade and elite imitation without requiring direct political control. A particularly revealing detail comes from saffron. Crocus flowers appear repeatedly in Akrotiri's wall paintings, most famously in scenes of gathering and offering. Saffron requires enormous labor because the useful stigmas must be collected individually from many flowers. The plant can serve as pigment, fragrance, seasoning, medicine, and perhaps ritual material. Its prominence in the imagery suggests that plants familiar from everyday landscapes can also carry ceremonial meaning. Yet the exact significance of these scenes remains uncertain, especially because no readable local narrative survives to explain them. The most haunting discovery at Akrotiri, however, is what archaeologists largely do not find. Human bodies are conspicuously absent from the excavated areas. Unlike Pompeii, there are no streets filled with victims apparently trapped by the final eruption. Valuable portable objects are also missing from many rooms. Furniture may have been removed, some storage vessels remain. But the overall pattern suggests that inhabitants had warning and evacuated before the catastrophic phase of the eruption. Evidence of earthquakes shortly before the burial strengthens this interpretation. Buildings had been damaged and repairs were underway. Rubble had been cleared into streets or organized for reconstruction. Residents may have left after severe tremors, returned to repair their homes, and then departed again when volcanic activity intensified. The exact sequence remains debated, but the absence of bodies suggests that the final destruction was not completely unexpected. Where those people went is unknown. Perhaps they escaped by sea to nearby islands. Perhaps some reached Crete or mainland Greece. Perhaps groups temporarily relocated and planned to return when the danger passed. If they left by ship, they may have carried valuables, tools, food, and religious objects with them. Archaeology is much better at preserving an abandoned building than tracking refugees who merge into another community. Their disappearance from Akrotiri does not necessarily mean their deaths. This creates a strange inversion of the usual archaeological tragedy. The town survives because its inhabitants do not in the sense that they necessarily perish, but because the physical community is separated from the people who gave it life. Rooms remain, painted walls remain, storage jars remain, streets remain. Yet the individuals who knew which household owned which doorway, which child slept upstairs, which family prepared food in a particular room, and what the painted ships meant to those who saw them every day vanish from the record. Soon afterward, the volcano enters its most violent phase. The island itself is transformed. Ash rises high into the atmosphere. Pumice falls across the region. Seawater surges against coastlines. The event becomes one of the largest Mediterranean eruptions of the last several thousand years. And because Crete's great palace civilization lies only about 100 kilometers to the south, an enduring historical mystery begins almost immediately for modern archaeology. Whether this catastrophe helped destroy the Minoan world, or whether the real collapse was still waiting beyond the horizon. When Thera finally erupts on a catastrophic scale, the event is violent enough to reshape the island itself. The eruption begins through a sequence of phases rather than one instantaneous explosion. Ash and pumice accumulate across the landscape. Explosive columns rise high above the volcano. Pyroclastic material spreads outward. Eventually, parts of the volcanic structure collapse, helping create the vast caldera that defines Santorini today. The scale is enormous by human standards, and communities around the southern Aegean would have seen or felt signs of it far beyond Thera. Yet the relationship between this disaster and the fate of the Minoan world has become one of the most misunderstood stories in ancient history. For much of the 20th century, it was tempting to imagine a simple chain of events. Thera erupts, tsunamis strike Crete, ash destroys crops, Minoan society collapses, Mycenaean Greeks then move into the weakened island. The story is dramatic, clean, and easy to remember. The archaeological evidence, however, refuses to cooperate with such simplicity. The eruption is undoubtedly devastating for Thera itself and disruptive across parts of the Aegean. But the major destruction of many Cretan palace centres occurs later. The interval between the eruption and the widespread destructions on Crete may span decades, depending on the chronological model used. Dating the eruption has itself become a major scholarly problem. Radiocarbon measurements, tree ring evidence, ice core discussions, pottery sequences, and Egyptian chronological connections have not always aligned neatly. Many scientific dates have favoured an eruption in the later 17th century BCE, often around the middle portion of that century, while traditional archaeological chronology long placed it somewhat later. The debate is technical and ongoing, and the precise year remains uncertain. What matters for the larger story is that the eruption does not appear to coincide exactly with the final end of the Minoan palace system. Still, the immediate physical effects could have been severe. Vast amounts of pumice and ash fall into the sea and onto nearby islands. On Thera, settlements are buried. Marine ecosystems and coastlines are disrupted. Shipping routes become dangerous or temporarily unusable. Ash carried by prevailing winds travels mainly eastward, affecting islands and perhaps parts of Anatolia more heavily than much of Crete. Deposits on Crete are generally thin, which argues against the idea that the entire island was smothered beneath enough ash to destroy agriculture for years. The sea may have been more dangerous. Geological investigations along the coasts of Crete and other Aegean islands have identified deposits that may be associated with tsunami activity linked to the eruption. Computer models suggest that collapsing volcanic material could generate powerful waves. On northern Crete, low-lying harbours and coastal settlements may have suffered badly. Ships anchored near shore could be smashed, warehouses flooded, and waterfront infrastructure destroyed. But tsunami damage is uneven. Waves lose energy inland and interact with coastlines in complicated ways. Many important Minoan centres lie away from exposed northern shores. Knossos, for example, is inland. A massive wave can devastate a port without destroying the political institutions located several kilometres away. The extent of actual tsunami destruction remains debated, and no evidence supports a single wave sweeping across Crete and instantly ending civilization. The more interesting possibility is that the eruption harms the Minoan system indirectly. A maritime economy depends not only on palaces but on ships, crews, ports, storage facilities, trading partners, and reliable routes. If Thera is an important node within Aegean exchange, its disappearance removes one part of that network. If coastal installations on Crete are damaged, trade may be disrupted further. If fleets are lost, rebuilding them requires timber, labour, and time. If religious or political authority has claimed some ability to preserve cosmic order, a disaster of such scale could also have psychological consequences that archaeology can barely detect. This is where certainty fades. No tablet from Crete survives saying that the eruption caused political unrest. No readable Minoan chronicle describes famine, panic, or religious crisis. The argument depends on patterns, timing, and plausible consequences rather than explicit testimony. Scholars still debate how much long-term damage the eruption actually causes. Some see it as a major destabilizing event that weakens Crete before later political collapse. Others consider its role secondary, emphasizing the evidence for substantial recovery and continuing prosperity afterward. That recovery is difficult to ignore. Minoan pottery continues to circulate. Palace centers remain active. Elite art and architecture continue to develop. Administrative systems function. Crete is not reduced to abandoned ruins immediately after Thera. In some places, there may even be reconstruction and renewed investment. A civilization capable of surviving earthquakes in earlier centuries appears once again able to absorb serious shocks. The eruption therefore becomes more useful as a lesson in how collapse actually works. Catastrophes do not always destroy complex societies immediately. Sometimes they damage one layer of a system while others survive. A port may vanish while inland institutions continue. Trade can contract and then recover. Political elites may redirect resources. Communities may adapt. A society can survive the disaster that later generations assume must have killed it, only to fall because of pressures that emerge years afterward. The eruption has also attracted attempts to connect it with legends. The most famous is Atlantis. Because Plato describes a powerful island society destroyed by catastrophic natural forces, Santorini has repeatedly been proposed as an inspiration. The resemblance is appealing at a broad level: an island, a prosperous maritime culture, and a devastating geological event. But Plato writes more than a millennium after the eruption, and uses Atlantis within a philosophical story containing many details that do not match Bronze Age Thera. There is no direct evidence that his account preserves a specific memory of the eruption. The theory remains popular, but it cannot be treated as established history. There is another, more subtle possibility. Catastrophic events can survive in cultural memory without preserving exact geography or chronology. Sailors may tell stories of an island shattered by fire, darkened skies, strange seas, and abandoned towns. Such memories can transform over generations. They can merge with other disasters, travel with migrants, and enter myths whose original context becomes impossible to recover. Whether this happened with Thera remains unknowable, but it illustrates how physical catastrophe and human storytelling can outlive one another. The eruption also leaves an unexpected scientific archive. Volcanic ash has a distinctive chemical fingerprint. When geologists identify microscopic particles in distant sediments, they can sometimes link those deposits back to Thera. The disaster that destroys Akrotiri thus becomes a chronological marker across the eastern Mediterranean. A moment of destruction becomes a tool for reconstructing time. Yet for the people of Crete, the eruption is not the end. That is what makes the next stage more unsettling. They survive the catastrophe that seems powerful enough to explain everything. Their palaces remain occupied, their ships return to the sea, their workshops continue producing luxury goods, their religious symbols remain visible. Then, later, destruction reaches many of the island's major centres in a much more selective pattern. The volcano has supplied modern observers with the spectacular suspect. But the true transformation of Minoan Crete appears to involve something slower, more political, and possibly more violent than the eruption alone. In the generations after the eruption of Thera, Crete does something that complicates every simple story about catastrophe. It continues. Workshops remain active. Palatial centres still collect goods. Fine pottery circulates. Ships continue to move through Aegean waters. The island does not become an empty shell waiting for outsiders to arrive. Instead, it enters a period in which prosperity and vulnerability exist side by side. On the surface, much of the system still works. Beneath that surface, however, the balance of power appears to be shifting, and the evidence for what happens next is both dramatic and incomplete. Around the 15th century BCE, destruction affects many major Minoan centres. Buildings burn, settlements are damaged, administrative activity ceases in several places. Yet the pattern is not uniform. Knossos survives longer than many other centres and seems to emerge in an altered political position. This unevenness matters because it makes a single natural disaster difficult to use as an explanation. Earthquakes can strike broad regions, but they do not usually spare one major centre while destroying many others in a pattern that also corresponds with political change. Fire can follow seismic activity, but repeated destruction across multiple sites may also indicate warfare, rebellion, or deliberate attack. Scholars still debate the causes. One possibility is internal conflict between Cretan centres. The palace system may never have been a unified kingdom in the first place. If Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, and other centres govern separate territories or networks, competition could intensify over resources, trade routes, and political influence. A weakened regional system after the Thera eruption might make such rivalries more dangerous. The destruction of competing palaces could then reflect the rise of one centre over others rather than the collapse of the island as a whole. Another possibility involves increasing Mycenaean influence from mainland Greece. By this time, powerful communities on the mainland are growing richer and more militarized. Their elites bury themselves with weapons, gold, imported luxuries, and symbols of authority. They admire Cretan art, administrative practices, and prestige goods, but they are not passive imitators. They are developing their own centers of power, and their involvement in Crete becomes difficult to deny after the destructions. The most important clue is writing. At Knossos, tablets appear in Linear B, a script adapted from the earlier Cretan writing tradition, but used to record an early form of Greek. This is a decisive linguistic change. Linear A remains undeciphered and almost certainly records a different language. Linear B, by contrast, can be read, and the language behind it is Greek. The presence of Greek administrative records at Knossos strongly suggests that people connected to the Mycenaean Greek world have gained major influence there. How that happens remains uncertain. It may involve conquest, Mycenaean warriors may attack Crete and seize key centres, but direct military invasion is difficult to prove archaeologically unless weapons, mass casualties, or unmistakable battle damage survive in clear contexts. Another possibility is gradual political takeover. Mainland elites may already be present through trade, marriage, mercenary service, or alliances. When Minoan political structures weaken, these groups could gain control from within. A third scenario combines both processes: long-term contact followed by episodes of violence. The evidence does not allow a single confident narrative. What survives in the record suggests a transformation in leadership and administration, but the mechanics remain obscure. Archaeology can reveal that Greek-speaking administrators are operating at Knossos. It cannot identify the first man who walks into a palace room and orders the scribes to change allegiance. The Linear B tablets themselves are astonishingly mundane. They do not celebrate conquest. They record sheep, textiles, grain, landholdings, chariots, bronze, personnel, offerings, and allocations. This is partly because the tablets are temporary administrative documents rather than historical chronicles. Clay is normally reused or discarded. The tablets survive because fires bake them accidentally, preserving records that were never meant to last. A palace destruction therefore creates its own archive. These records show that Knossos remains a powerful bureaucratic centre under Greek-speaking administration. Officials track enormous numbers of sheep, probably connected to wool production. Craftspeople are organised by profession. Religious offerings are recorded to name deities, some of whom later appear in Greek religion. Chariot components and military equipment are carefully accounted for. This does not look like a society that has merely wandered into the ruins after collapse. It suggests that an existing administrative system has been appropriated and adapted. Minoan culture does not vanish at the moment political control changes. Art styles, religious practices, architecture, craft techniques, and local traditions continue. This is another reminder that political conquest and cultural replacement are not the same thing. A new ruling group can adopt large portions of the system it takes over. Indeed, successful conquerors often do exactly that because established institutions are useful. Storerooms, scribes, workshops, trade contacts, and religious centres represent accumulated knowledge that is easier to control than rebuild from nothing. Crete therefore enters a hybrid phase. Greek-speaking administrators operate within a world still deeply shaped by earlier Cretan traditions. Minoan symbols continue to influence the mainland as well. The distinction between Minoan and Mycenaean becomes less absolute at the level of elite culture. Objects, artistic themes, technologies, and ritual practices move in both directions. One lesser-known detail reveals how personal such exchanges could be. Burial evidence and material culture suggest that some mainland elites adopt Cretan drinking vessels, jewelry styles, seal stones, and imagery not simply because those items are useful, but because they communicate sophistication. Cretan culture has become prestigious. Even groups gaining political advantage over Crete may present themselves using symbols associated with the society they are surpassing. Eventually, Knossos itself suffers destruction and loses its earlier dominance. The dating and political interpretation remain debated, but by the later Bronze Age the centre of gravity has clearly shifted toward mainland Greece. Crete still contains important communities, and its people remain part of Aegean exchange. Yet the age in which its palace centres stand at the heart of regional power has ended. What replaces them is not a less complex world. On the contrary, Mainland rulers build citadels whose walls are designed to intimidate, organize territories through bureaucracies, maintain chariots and weapon stores, and connect their kingdoms to the eastern Mediterranean. Their architecture reflects a different political imagination, where Cretan palaces often seem open and integrated into urban landscapes. Mainland strongholds rise behind massive fortifications. Authority becomes increasingly associated with warriors, dynasties, and defensible centres. The sea has not stopped mattering. Crete's long influence has already transformed the Aegean, but now power is moving northward, toward rocky hills where rulers surround themselves with stone walls so enormous that later Greeks will claim ordinary humans could not possibly have built them. On the Greek mainland, power begins to take a harder shape. The hills above fertile plains are crowned not by open palace complexes like those of Crete, but by fortified centres built to dominate the land around them. At Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and other sites, ruling elites gather wealth, organize labour, control agricultural production, and increasingly define authority through warfare. The people who inhabit these kingdoms speak an early form of Greek, and modern archaeology calls their civilization Mycenaean, after the most famous of their strongholds. Their rise does not erase the older Aegean world. It absorbs it, imitates it, and eventually reshapes it into something unmistakably different. Mycenae itself occupies a commanding position in the northeastern Peloponnese. The citadel sits above routes linking the Argolid plain with surrounding valleys and the sea. Its fortifications are constructed from enormous blocks of limestone fitted into thick walls. Later Greeks, confronted with masonry whose builders had already disappeared from living memory, called it Cyclopean because they imagined only the giant Cyclopes could have moved stones of such size. The explanation is mythical, but the astonishment is understandable. These walls are not merely defensive, they make political power visible from a distance. The contrast with Crete is striking. Minoan palace centres generally lack the massive fortifications that characterise many Mycenaean citadels. That difference once encouraged simple stereotypes of peaceful Minoans and warlike mainland Greeks. But archaeology does not support such a clean division. Minoan art includes weapons and potentially dangerous ritual performances, while Mycenaean society also depends on farming, administration, ceremony, trade, and craft production. Still, military identity is unquestionably more prominent in elite mainland burials and iconography. Long before the Great Walls reach their final form, wealthy individuals at Mycenae are being buried with extraordinary objects. The shaft graves, dating largely to the 17th and 16th centuries BCE, contain swords, daggers, gold vessels, jewellery, seal stones, bronze armour components, and famous gold funerary masks. When Heinrich Schliemann excavated one of these cemeteries in the 19th century, he believed he had discovered the tombs of figures from Homeric legend. The best-known mask became popularly associated with Agamemnon, but it predates the traditional period of the Trojan War by centuries. Its real owner remains unknown. The burials nevertheless reveal something important. Mainland elites are becoming extremely wealthy at roughly the time Crete stands at the height of its influence. Many objects found in the graves are imported from Crete or inspired by Minoan styles. Swords combine mainland forms with elaborate decorative techniques. Seal stones display imagery associated with Cretan craftsmanship. Gold and exotic materials testify to far-reaching exchange, rather than emerging in isolation. Mycenaean elites build power while participating deeply in the cultural networks of the southern Aegean, This creates a fascinating contradiction. The mainland warriors who eventually dominate much of the Aegean first learn many of the visual languages of prestige from Crete. They adopt Cretan administrative practices, artistic motifs, religious symbols, luxury goods, and perhaps elements of ceremonial behavior. Yet they place these borrowed traditions inside a political world that increasingly emphasizes fortified citadels, dynastic burial, weaponry, and territorial authority. The warrior ideal can be seen in graves containing long bronze swords, spearheads, armor, and decorated daggers. Some blades are almost impractically elaborate, their surfaces inlaid with hunting scenes or precious metals. Such weapons are not merely tools for killing, they are statements about status. A bronze sword requires expensive materials and skilled labor. An ornate sword requires even more. To carry one is to display access to networks of craftsmen, metal, and wealth. Horses and chariots also become important markers of elite power. Linear B records from later palaces carefully list chariot components, wheels, armor, and related equipment. Chariots are useful in transport, display, and perhaps certain forms of warfare, though scholars still debate exactly how they function on the uneven landscapes of Greece. They may be less important as mass battlefield weapons than as symbols of aristocratic mobility and prestige. Either way, maintaining horses and vehicles requires substantial resources, placing them far beyond the reach of ordinary households. The rise of these elites depends on the agricultural world below the citadels. Wheat and barley grow in plains and valleys. Olive trees and vines produce valuable commodities. Sheep provide wool for textile industries. Herds move through uplands. Craftspeople manufacture pottery, weapons, tools, and luxury goods. Labourers quarry stone and haul building materials. A fortified palace is therefore the visible summit of a much larger system supported by villages, fields, workshops, and roads. Mycenaean rulers are often imagined as absolute kings, but their political territories probably vary considerably in size and structure. Some palaces may control broad regions, while smaller centres operate with greater independence. Linear B uses the term wonax for the highest-ranking figure in palace administration, a word that survives much later in altered form in Greek poetic language. Another title, lauagetus, appears to designate an important official whose precise role is uncertain. Beneath them are administrators, local leaders, religious personnel, craftspeople, and workers whose positions can sometimes be glimpsed through bureaucratic records. At this stage, however, not every major mainland centre has preserved tablets, and much of the early political story must still be inferred from archaeology. Massive tombs provide another clue. Beginning in the later Middle Bronze Age and continuing into the Mycenaean period, elites construct tholos tombs, circular burial chambers covered by corbelled domes, and approach through long entrance passages. Some are astonishing engineering achievements. The so-called Treasury of Atreus at Mycenae has a monumental doorway and a vast interior dome built from carefully fitted stone courses. Its ancient name is unknown, as is the identity of the ruler buried there. These tombs convert death into architecture. A powerful family does not simply bury its dead, it creates a landscape of ancestral authority. Tombs remain visible outside settlements, reminding later generations that the ruling order claims deep roots. Wealth placed inside them may be lost to the living, but the expenditure itself demonstrates that the dynasty can afford such loss. One surprising detail is that many Mycenaean centres are not coastal. Their rulers depend heavily on maritime exchange, yet their principal citadels often sit inland on defensible heights. Ports and coastal settlements connect them to the sea, but political centres remain protected behind distance and walls. This suggests a system in which maritime wealth is drawn inland and transformed into political power. Ships bring copper, ivory, gold, glass, and luxury goods. The citadel turns those materials into weapons, offerings, ornaments, and symbols of hierarchy. By the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, Mycenaean influence expands rapidly. Mainland pottery appears across the Mediterranean. Greek-speaking administrators operate on Crete. Mycenaean elites establish stronger links with Cyprus, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. The warrior kingdoms that once stood in the cultural shadow of Crete are beginning to occupy the centre of the Aegean world. Their walls make them look permanent. Their tombs suggest dynasties meant to endure. Their weapons advertise confidence. But their greatest strength is not stone alone. It is the bureaucratic machinery developing behind those walls, a system capable of counting animals, rationing grain, directing craftspeople, recording offerings, and preparing military equipment with an attention to detail that survives only because, centuries later, fire will bake its fragile records into permanence. Behind the colossal walls of the Mycenaean citadels, the machinery of government becomes visible in a way that had remained frustratingly obscure on Minoan Crete. This is not because the mainland kingdoms leave behind great histories of themselves. They do not. Their rulers do not preserve epic accounts of campaigns, royal genealogies, or explanations of their political ambitions. Instead, what survives is something much less glamorous and, in many ways, much more revealing paperwork. Thin clay tablets record sheep, bronze, grain, textiles, personnel, land, offerings, chariot equipment, and countless other details of palace administration. They were never intended to last. Most would probably have been discarded once their information became obsolete. They survive only because fires that destroyed the palaces accidentally baked the clay hard enough to preserve it. The script is Linear B, adapted from the earlier Cretan writing tradition. Its decipherment in the 20th century transformed understanding of the Mycenaean world, because the language encoded in the signs proved to be Greek. The discovery pushed written Greek centuries deeper into the past than many scholars had expected. Suddenly, the supposedly shadowy warrior kingdoms of the late Bronze Age could be heard, not in heroic poetry composed generations later, but in the dry vocabulary of accountants. Those accountants reveal a world organized around palace centers at Pylos, Knossos, Thebes, and other sites. Scribes track resources with remarkable precision. The palace is not merely the residence of a ruler, it is the administrative heart of a regional economy. It receives goods, stores them, allocates them, and directs labor. It controls some land directly while other land is held under different arrangements by communities, officials, religious institutions, and individuals. Exactly how comprehensive palace control is remains debated, because the surviving tablets represent only part of the economy. Many households must have produced and exchanged goods outside direct bureaucratic supervision. Even so, the records show that the palace reaches deeply into agricultural and craft production. At the top of the hierarchy stands the one-axe. The precise powers of this ruler are difficult to reconstruct, but he appears to occupy the highest political and perhaps religious position. Beneath him is the lauagetas, another elite figure whose responsibilities remain uncertain. Local officials, collectors, religious personnel, military administrators, and workshop supervisors form additional layers. The system is hierarchical, but it is also dependent on countless people whose names or occupations appear only because someone has to count what they produce. Sheep are one of the clearest examples. Some Linear B archives record enormous flocks linked to wool production. Palace officials track animals by location, sex, ownership status, and expected output. Wool is then distributed into textile industries employing large numbers of workers. Many of those workers are women, sometimes recorded in groups alongside children. The tablets do not tell us how these women experience their labour, or whether their status ranges from dependent workers to enslaved captives. But they reveal that textile production is not a minor domestic activity. It is a large-scale economic enterprise. Textiles are valuable because they turn agricultural wealth into portable goods. Wool can be processed, dyed, woven, stored, gifted, or traded abroad. Fine cloth is both practical and prestigious. Producing it requires time, skilled labour, and coordination. A palace capable of organising hundreds of textile workers can transform flocks grazing on distant hillsides into luxury commodities moving across the Mediterranean. Metal is managed with similar care. Bronze depends on copper and tin, neither of which is uniformly available in mainland Greece. Copper arrives through long-distance networks, especially from Cyprus, while the sources of much Bronze Age tin remain more difficult to trace and are still debated. Palace records sometimes distribute measured amounts of bronze to smiths working in different communities. These craftspeople manufacture tools, weapons, fittings, and other objects, then return finished products or fulfill assigned obligations. The system therefore connects distant mines, Mediterranean shipping, palace administrators, local workshops, and military equipment in one chain. Chariots appear frequently enough to show their importance to elite organization. Tablets list wheels, body components, armor, and horses. Some vehicles may be complete while others are stored as parts. Maintaining them requires specialized woodworking, leatherworking, bronze fittings, animal care, and road access. The image of a warrior riding into battle may be dramatic, but behind that warrior stands an administrative system counting wheels and assigning craftsmen. Food is equally bureaucratic. Grain, wine, oil, figs, and livestock move through palace accounts. Olive oil can be scented or prepared for particular uses. Rations can be issued to workers. Religious festivals require offerings. Animals are designated for sacrifice. At Pylos, one set of records made shortly before the palace's destruction appears to concern preparations involving personnel, coastal defence, and religious offerings. Though interpreting these tablets as evidence of an imminent invasion remains controversial, because they capture only a brief administrative moment, it is dangerous to turn every unusual allocation into proof of a crisis. Religion is embedded deeply in this economy. Tablets record offerings to deities whose names sometimes resemble those of later Greek gods, including forms associated with Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Dionysus, and others. Yet later, Greek religion cannot simply be projected backward unchanged. The Bronze Age divine world contains names and cult arrangements that do not survive clearly into later periods, while familiar gods may occupy different roles. At Pylos, Poseidon appears particularly important, perhaps more prominent than a reader of classical mythology would expect. This continuity is one of the most remarkable features of the records. Political structures will collapse. Writing will disappear from Greece for centuries, and palace centres will burn. Yet some divine names survive into later Greek tradition. Cultural memory proves more durable than bureaucracy. The palace also relies on taxation or obligatory contributions from surrounding districts. Different communities deliver particular goods, animals, or labour. This arrangement gives the impression of centralised strength, but it contains a hidden weakness. Complex systems are efficient when connections remain stable. If administrators can move wool, bronze, grain, workers, and information reliably, specialization produces enormous wealth. But specialization also creates dependence. A smith assigned bronze by the palace depends on the palace receiving imported metal. Textile workers depend on organized wool supplies. Chariot workshops depend on multiple specialist crafts. Officials depend on records and transport. The more interconnected the system becomes, the more disruption in one area can spread into others. No Mycenaean administrator is writing a theory of systemic risk. To the people living inside these kingdoms, bureaucracy likely looks like strength. Storehouses are full, workshops are active, fortifications expand, roads connect settlements, ships carry goods abroad. The ruler's authority reaches across valleys that earlier communities could never have coordinated so closely. Yet the tablets preserve an irony their writers could not see. The records exist precisely because the administrative centres are eventually destroyed. A system built to organise the present becomes known to the future because it fails catastrophically. Before that failure comes, however, the Mycenaean kingdoms reach farther outward than ever. Their pottery appears in foreign ports. Their envoys and merchants participate in networks stretching from Egypt to Anatolia, copper from Cyprus, ivory from distant lands, glass, gold, spices, timber, and luxury goods move through an increasingly interconnected eastern Mediterranean. The Aegean kingdoms are no longer peripheral participants in this world. They have become part of its international political economy, and that economy is about to make them wealthy enough to appear powerful, connected enough to seem secure, and dependent enough that trouble in distant lands can eventually reach all the way to the gates of Mycenae. By the height of the late Bronze Age, the Aegean is no longer a collection of kingdoms looking outward from the margins of a larger world. It is fully entangled in one of the most complex international systems of the ancient Mediterranean. Ships leave mainland ports carrying pottery, textiles, oil, wine, and crafted goods. They return with copper, ivory, glass, precious metals, exotic materials, and objects made far beyond the Aegean. Merchants, envoys, craftspeople, sailors, and perhaps mercenaries move through the same routes. Political power depends increasingly on networks that stretch well beyond any single coastline. Cyprus is especially important because of copper. Bronze requires copper and tin, and the demand for metal links palace economies to distant sources. Copper often moves in large ingot forms, some shaped in ways that make them easier to carry or secure aboard ships. These ingots appear in shipwrecks, palatial contexts, and trading centres across the eastern Mediterranean. The Aegean kingdoms may control workshops and weapons production, but they cannot simply manufacture bronze from resources found at home. Their strength depends on access to trade. The clearest glimpse of this interconnected world comes from shipwrecks. The famous wreck at Uluburun, found off the coast of southern Anatolia and dating to the later 14th century BCE, carried a cargo so diverse that it resembles a floating inventory of Mediterranean globalization. Hundreds of copper ingots formed the largest part of the load, accompanied by tin, glass ingots, ivory, ebony, resins, pottery, luxury objects, jewellery, weapons, foodstuffs, and personal possessions. Some goods originated in regions separated by thousands of kilometers. The ship itself was not necessarily Mycenaean, and its crew may have come from the Levant or another eastern Mediterranean community. That is precisely what makes the wreck so valuable. It demonstrates that Aegean societies participate in networks maintained by many peoples rather than operating through a self-contained trading empire. Mycenaean objects aboard the vessel suggest contact with the Greek world, but merchants do not have to share language or political identity to exchange goods. The Bronze Age Sea is international in practice long before the modern concept of an international economy exists. Some of the most ordinary cargoes are also among the most revealing. Large jars carry food and liquids. Resin may be used for incense, medicine, preservation, or ritual. Glass ingots provide raw material for luxury workshops. Ivory can become furniture inlays, decorative boxes, weapon fittings, or ceremonial objects. A raw material arriving at a palace may pass through several specialists before becoming the finished artifact placed in an elite tomb. The journey of a single luxury object can therefore connect miners, sailors, merchants, palace officials, craftspeople, rulers, and eventually the dead. Egyptian evidence places the Aegean within another prestigious sphere. Wall paintings in Egyptian tombs depict foreign visitors carrying elaborate vessels and goods. Some figures have been associated with the people Egyptians called Keftiu, often linked by scholars with Crete or the wider Aegean. The identification is broadly plausible but not always straightforward, because Egyptian artists work within their own representational conventions. Still, imported Aegean pottery and other objects found in Egypt confirm substantial contact. Egyptian goods travel in the opposite direction. Scarabs, stone vessels, faience, ivory, and luxury materials reach Aegean elites. These items are valuable not merely because of their physical properties, but because distance itself adds prestige. An object from Egypt carries associations with a powerful, wealthy, and ancient kingdom. Possessing such an item allows an Aegean ruler to display access to networks beyond the reach of ordinary households. Farther east, the Levantine ports serve as essential intermediaries. Cities along the coasts of what are now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel connect maritime traffic with inland states and caravan routes. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, becomes one of the most cosmopolitan centers of the late Bronze Age. Its archives contain diplomatic correspondence, commercial records, religious texts, and administrative documents in multiple languages and scripts, although the Aegean palaces leave nothing comparable. Trade links connect them indirectly to this documentary world. Anatolia forms another complicated frontier. The Hittite Empire controls much of central Anatolia and influences western regions through vassals, alliances, and military campaigns. Hittite texts mention a land called Ahiawa, which many scholars associate with Mycenaean Greeks or a major Mycenaean political power. The linguistic and historical identification is widely accepted as plausible, though details remain debated. If Ahiawa does refer to the Mycenaean sphere, then mainland rulers are important enough to appear in the diplomatic concerns of one of the great Near Eastern empires. This does not mean there is one unified Mycenaean empire. The Linear B evidence points toward multiple palace kingdoms, and no surviving record proves that a single king rules all mainland Greece. Yet one ruler may at times command enough influence to deal with Anatolian powers on relatively high diplomatic terms. Political relationships could change rapidly, with alliances, dynastic marriages, local rebellions, and proxy conflicts along the western Anatolian coast. Trade is therefore inseparable from politics. A harbour is valuable because goods pass through it. An island can matter because it controls a sailing route. A local ruler who secures safe passage, protects merchants, or monopolizes access to metal can strengthen his palace without conquering vast territory. Conversely, instability in one strategic region can disrupt kingdoms far away. The sea itself imposes limits. Bronze Age sailing is highly seasonal. Storms, winds, currents, and poor visibility can delay voyages for days or weeks. Ships must carry fresh water and food. Hulls need constant maintenance. Harbours become lifelines. Crews depend on local knowledge, and navigation often follows recognizable coastlines rather than risking unnecessary stretches of open sea. Yet sailors are capable of substantial crossings, and repeated voyages create corridors of exchange known through experience rather than written charts. One surprising consequence of this connectivity is standardization. Weights, measures, container types, artistic forms, and administrative habits often show similarities across large areas. They are not fully uniform, but long-distance exchange encourages people to recognize shared conventions. Merchants need ways to estimate value. Palaces need to record quantities. Craftspeople learn foreign techniques. Diplomats exchange gifts whose significance must be understood by both sides. This network makes the Late Bronze Age extraordinarily wealthy, but it also creates a system in which dependence spreads across borders. A Mycenaean palace needs copper from abroad. A Cypriot producer needs ships and markets. Eastern courts demand luxury goods. Maritime communities depend on stable ports. Palace workshops rely on regular supplies of raw materials. The prosperity of one kingdom becomes increasingly tied to conditions in another. For generations, this complexity works remarkably well. Goods move across seas. Rulers accumulate treasures. Workshops flourish. Ships link distant courts. Palaces record the movement of resources with confidence. But interconnected systems carry a hidden danger. When disruption begins, it does not have to begin everywhere at once. A conflict in Anatolia can disturb trade routes. A drought in the Levant can weaken ports. Rebellion can interrupt tribute. The destruction of one commercial centre can redirect ships toward already strained alternatives. The Aegean kingdoms are reaching the peak of their international influence, just as the Eastern Mediterranean system supporting that influence becomes increasingly fragile. And nowhere is the overlap between commerce, diplomacy, warfare, and later memory more haunting than at a fortified city near the entrance to the Dardanelles, a place later generations will call Troy. Near the northwestern edge of Anatolia, where the waterways leading toward the Black Sea narrow into one of the most strategically important corridors of the ancient world, a fortified settlement rises above the surrounding plain. Later generations will call it Troy. Its name will become inseparable from Helen, Achilles, Hector, wooden horses, burning towers, and a war so famous that it will shape European literature for thousands of years. But beneath the poetry lies a much older and more difficult problem. Bronze Age Troy was real. It was destroyed and rebuilt many times. It stood in a position capable of controlling or influencing movement between the Aegean and the Straits. What remains uncertain is how much of the later legendary war preserves a memory of actual late Bronze Age conflict. The archaeological site at Hisarlik is not one city but a stack of cities. Human occupation accumulated there over millennia, each settlement building upon the remains of earlier ones. Archaeologists have divided these layers into major phases, traditionally numbered Troy I through Troy IX, with numerous subdivisions. For the period most often associated with a possible Trojan War, attention falls especially on Troy VI and Troy VII, settlements belonging to the late Bronze Age. Troy VI is impressive. Massive sloping stone walls enclose the citadel. Towers reinforce strategic points. Large buildings stand inside the defences. The architecture suggests wealth, planning, and substantial labour organisation. The lower settlement outside the citadel appears to have extended beyond the walls, meaning the population may have been much larger than early excavators assumed. Its position is equally significant. The settlement overlooks routes connecting the Aegean with the Dardanelles, although the exact ancient coastline differed from the modern one because sediments have altered the landscape over thousands of years. Control of this location could bring advantages even if Troy never literally closed the straits to passing ships. Sailors dealing with difficult winds and currents might need nearby anchorages, provisions, pilots, or trading partners. Land routes through northwestern Anatolia also pass through the broader region. Troy therefore sits near an interface between maritime and terrestrial networks. Its wealth may come partly from agriculture and regional control, partly from participation in trade, and partly from the political value of occupying such a strategic zone. Yet Troy VI ends in destruction. Walls collapse, buildings are damaged, and the pattern has often been interpreted as the result of a major earthquake rather than an enemy assault. There is not enough evidence of widespread burning or battlefield destruction to make warfare the obvious explanation. If a powerful earthquake brought down sections of the city, the event would have been devastating but not final. The settlement is rebuilt. The succeeding phase, Troy Sevesta, is where the mystery deepens. Houses appear more densely packed within the citadel. Large storage jars are sunk into floors, possibly reflecting a need to store greater quantities of food. Some scholars have interpreted these changes as evidence that inhabitants are preparing for siege or sheltering additional people behind the defences. Others caution that dense occupation and increased storage can have many explanations, including demographic growth or changing economic practices. Archaeology rarely provides a label explaining why a jar was buried in a floor. This settlement ends violently, probably around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE depending on chronological interpretation. Destruction by fire is widespread. Human remains have been found in contexts suggesting sudden violence, though not enough to reconstruct a great massacre. Arrowheads and other evidence have sometimes been cited as signs of attack. Troy VII therefore provides a plausible archaeological candidate for a city destroyed during warfare in approximately the era later Greek tradition associates with the Trojan conflict. Plausible, however, is not the same as proven. Centuries separate the destruction of Bronze Age Troy from the written forms of the Iliad and Odyssey that survive from archaic Greece. Oral traditions can preserve memories for surprisingly long periods, but they transform in transmission. Names shift, characters merge. Geography can be remembered more accurately than chronology. A local conflict can become a 10-year international war. Real rulers can acquire supernatural ancestry. The weapons, customs, and institutions of different centuries can coexist within the same epic because generations of singers continuously reshape inherited material. The Hittite archives provide an independent clue. Texts from late Bronze Age Anatolia mention a place called Wilusa, which many scholars identify with Ilios, another ancient Greek name associated with Troy. The linguistic connection is widely considered strong, though details continue to be discussed. Hittite documents also refer to a Western power called Ahiawa, generally associated with the Mycenaean Greek world. Suddenly the broad geopolitical setting of the legend appears less impossible. Hittite rulers really are concerned with Western Anatolian territories, and a power connected with Mycenaean Greeks really does intervene in Anatolian affairs. One particularly intriguing Hittite text refers to earlier hostility involving Wilusa and Ahiawa before diplomatic relations improve. It does not describe the Trojan War of Homer. There is no Achilles, no Helen, no wooden horse, and no 10-year siege. But it demonstrates that tensions involving a place likely connected with Troy and a power likely connected with Mycenaean Greece exist within the diplomatic world of the late Bronze Age. Another Anatolian name, Taruisa, has also been compared with the Greek name Troia. Such linguistic correspondences strengthen the possibility that Greek tradition preserves genuine Bronze Age place names. But even if Wilusa is Troy and Ahiawa represents Mycenaean Greeks, the historical details of any conflict remain unclear. The struggle might involve dynastic succession, access to trade routes, competing alliances, or control over Western Anatolian states rather than the romantic cause later poetry gives it. This is where archaeology and legend must be kept carefully separated. Heinrich Schliemann approached Troy convinced that Homer provided a guide to literal history. His excavations in the 19th century transformed the site, but he also damaged it severely. In his rush to reach what he believed was Priam's Troy, he cut through later archaeological layers and misidentified an earlier treasure as belonging to the legendary king. The objects he called Priam's treasure actually date from many centuries before the likely late Bronze Age setting of the Trojan tradition. The mistake became famous because expectation had shaped interpretation. Modern archaeology is more cautious. It does not need the Iliad to be a factual war report in order for Troy to matter. The city demonstrates that substantial fortified centres exist along the western Anatolian frontier. Hittite texts demonstrate that this frontier is politically unstable. Mycenaean material appears along Anatolian coasts. Greek-speaking powers are capable of interfering in the region. Conflict is therefore entirely plausible, perhaps even repeated conflict over generations. What survives in later tradition may be a compressed memory of many such events rather than one enormous war. Several expeditions, raids, dynastic disputes, and destructions could have blended into a single heroic narrative. A city destroyed during the wider upheavals around 1200 BCE could become the focal point for memories of an entire vanished age. That possibility is especially haunting because Troy's destruction does not occur in isolation. At roughly the same broad historical moment, cities across Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean begin to burn or decline. Hittite imperial authority collapses. Gurit disappears. Mycenaean palaces are destroyed. Trade networks fracture. Written administrations vanish from regions where they had operated for centuries. The legendary war at Troy may therefore stand at the edge of something much larger than a single siege. Behind the remembered flames of one city lies a Mediterranean world beginning to break apart. Around the turn of the 12th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean begins to lose the stability that had sustained its great palace economies for generations. The change does not arrive everywhere on the same day, and no single city witnesses the whole pattern. Instead, destruction appears in different places, sometimes separated by years or decades. Fortified centres burn. Administrative archives cease. trade routes become less reliable. Populations move. Some settlements shrink while others are abandoned altogether. In hindsight, these events look like one enormous collapse, but for the people living through them, the crisis probably arrives as a sequence of local emergencies whose connection is not immediately obvious. On mainland Greece, the first unmistakable sign is the destruction of the palace system itself. Pylos burns. Mycenae suffers repeated destruction and disruption. Tiryns is damaged. Thebes and other centres also experience upheaval. Not every settlement disappears, and some places continue to be occupied after the palaces fall. But the bureaucratic structures recorded in Linear B vanish with remarkable speed. Scribes stop producing tablets. Central storerooms lose their function. Large-scale building projects cease. The political world organized around the Wanax breaks apart. Pylos is particularly revealing because its destruction preserves one of the richest Linear B archives. Some tablets appear to record preparations involving coastal areas, watch arrangements, personnel, military equipment, and religious offerings. These texts have often been interpreted as signs that the palace authorities fear an imminent attack from the sea. Yet caution is necessary. The tablets were never written as narrative reports, and their administrative shorthand can be difficult to interpret. Scholars still debate whether they describe an extraordinary emergency or routine obligations that happen to be recorded shortly before disaster. Whatever the palace expected, Pylos burns violently and is not rebuilt as a functioning palace centre. The fire that destroys the buildings bakes the clay tablets and preserves the final bureaucracy of a kingdom that disappears almost immediately afterward. The irony seen elsewhere in Mycenaean archives becomes especially sharp here. The administrative system becomes legible to modern historians because the event that ended it accidentally protects its records. The upheaval is not confined to Greece. Across western Anatolia, political structures shift rapidly. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, collapses around the same broad period. Its capital at Hattusa is abandoned, though evidence suggests parts of the city may have been evacuated before final destruction. The imperial system fragments into smaller successor states, especially farther south and east. The disappearance of Hittite authority destabilizes regions that had depended on its diplomatic and military network. On the Syrian coast, Ugarit meets a more abrupt end. The city's archives contain letters written during its final days, including urgent references to enemy ships and military vulnerability. These documents are among the most haunting written traces of the wider crisis, because they show rulers attempting to respond while communication networks are still functioning. One letter describes enemy ships appearing while the city's own forces are elsewhere. Yet even here, the evidence does not identify one single force responsible for everything happening across the Mediterranean. Cyprus experiences destruction and restructuring. Settlements in the Levant are attacked, abandoned, rebuilt, or transformed. Egypt survives. But Egyptian inscriptions describe major conflicts involving groups conventionally known as the Sea Peoples. Pharaoh Rameses III presents his victories over these enemies as a defense of Egypt against forces that have already devastated other lands. His inscriptions are valuable, but they are royal propaganda as well as historical evidence. Egyptian kings emphasize victory, chaos overcome, and divine support. Their texts cannot simply be read as neutral descriptions of events. The names attached to the Sea Peoples complicate matters further. Groups such as the Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Denayan, and others appear in Egyptian records, but their origins and identities remain disputed. Some may have come from regions around the Aegean or Anatolia. Others may be connected with central Mediterranean communities. They are unlikely to represent one unified nation moving together under a single command. The label Sea Peoples is modern shorthand for several groups recorded in Egyptian sources, not the name of a known Bronze Age confederation. For years, popular accounts treated these peoples as the primary destroyers of the eastern Mediterranean. An enormous wave of invaders supposedly swept through the region, burning cities and toppling empires. Archaeology paints a far more complicated picture. There is evidence of warfare and migration, but many destructions cannot be confidently attributed to outside invaders. Some sites show no clear battle damage. Others decline before the supposed invasions. Political systems were already under strain in certain regions. A single military explanation cannot account for the timing or diversity of the evidence. Environmental stress may form another part of the crisis. Paleoclimate studies suggest periods of drought affected portions of the eastern Mediterranean around the end of the Bronze Age. Evidence comes from pollen records, lake sediments, speleothems, and other environmental archives. The exact timing and severity vary by region, and scholars still debate how closely individual drought episodes align with political collapse. Climate does not burn a palace directly, but repeated poor harvests can weaken states by increasing food prices, reducing surplus, encouraging migration, and undermining confidence in rulers. Earthquakes add another potential source of disruption. The Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean sit in a tectonically active zone, and many Bronze Age settlements show evidence of seismic damage. Some researchers have proposed an earthquake storm, a period in which multiple major earthquakes struck important centers over several decades. This could explain certain destruction layers, but earthquake evidence is notoriously difficult to distinguish from later building collapse, warfare, or abandonment. Even when earthquakes occur, they do not automatically explain why political systems fail to recover afterward. Internal rebellion is equally difficult to detect but impossible to dismiss. Palace economies are hierarchical. They extract agricultural produce and labor from surrounding communities. They maintain elite lifestyles, military equipment, ceremonial centers, and administrative specialists. During times of scarcity, the demands imposed by palaces may become increasingly burdensome. Dependent workers, local leaders, or rival elites could resist. Fires found in administrative centers might sometimes be caused by attackers from within rather than invaders from overseas. Another pressure may come from changes in warfare. New weapons and tactics can alter the balance between centralized armies and smaller mobile groups. The spread of iron is sometimes brought into this discussion, though iron does not immediately replace bronze and is not a simple technological cause of collapse. Bronze remains important for generations. What matters more may be that access to imported metals becomes less reliable as trade networks deteriorate, making the old palace-controlled military economy harder to maintain. Trade disruption itself can become a cause rather than merely a consequence. The palaces rely heavily on imported copper, tin, ivory, luxury goods, and perhaps other materials. If ports are destroyed in one region, shipping becomes less predictable elsewhere. If a trading partner collapses, merchants lose markets. If rulers can no longer guarantee safe passage, voyages become riskier. The interconnected system that once multiplied wealth begins transmitting instability. This is the defining feature of the crisis. Individual explanations do not need to compete as though only one can be correct. Drought can encourage migration. Migration can intensify conflict. Conflict can interrupt trade. Trade disruption can weaken palace economies. Weak rulers can face rebellion. Earthquakes can strike already strained cities. A rebuilt settlement can then be destroyed by war a decade later. No single explanation fully accounts for this sequence because the collapse may be the product of interacting stresses. By around 1200 BCE, the world of international courts, gift exchange, specialized palace industries, and predictable maritime commerce is coming apart. People continue farming, sailing, trading, fighting, worshipping, and raising families. But the structures coordinating those activities at the highest level begin to disappear. The palace kingdoms have not yet vanished from memory, but they have lost the ability to reproduce themselves. Their walls still stand. Their storerooms still contain fragments of the old economy. Roads still lead towards citadels. Yet the network that gave those places meaning is unraveling faster than any single ruler can repair it. And in the destruction layers scattered from Greece to Anatolia and the Levant, later generations will search for one culprit when the evidence increasingly points towards something more unsettling. A civilization can collapse, not because one enemy destroys it, but because too many connected systems fail at once. For generations, the collapse of the late Bronze Age was told almost like a detective story with one principal suspect. The Sea Peoples appeared in Egyptian inscriptions at roughly the same time that cities burned from Anatolia to the Levant, and it was tempting to connect every ruined palace, every abandoned port, and every broken trade route to a single wave of invasion. The picture was dramatic. Fleets arrive from the west. Armies move along the coasts. Kingdoms fall in rapid succession. And the civilized world is overwhelmed by outsiders. Yet the closer archaeology looks at the evidence, the harder it becomes to sustain such a simple explanation. The Sea Peoples certainly existed as groups known to Egyptian authorities. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Meneptah and Rameses III name several peoples involved in conflict, some arriving by sea and others apparently moving overland with families and possessions. Their names include Peliset, Cheka, Shurden, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh. Some may have connections with regions around the Aegean, Anatolia, or central Mediterranean, but these identifications remain uncertain. The Egyptian sources do not describe one unified nation. They describe multiple groups participating in episodes of migration and warfare whose precise origins are difficult to trace. Even more importantly, Egyptian records are not neutral reporting. They are royal monuments designed to present the pharaoh as the defender of cosmic order. Enemies are shown defeated, bound, or crushed beneath Egyptian power because that is how kingship is supposed to be represented. Rameses III's inscriptions at Medinet Habu are invaluable because they preserve names, images, and descriptions of conflict, but they cannot by themselves reconstruct the entire political crisis occurring across the Mediterranean. Archaeological destruction layers add another complication. Some cities clearly suffer violent attack, but others show evidence more consistent with abandonment, internal fire, earthquake damage, or gradual decline. At several sites, destruction does not occur at precisely the same time. The collapse unfolds across decades. If one invading army were responsible for everything, the chronology should be easier to align. The Mycenaean mainland illustrates this problem. Pylos appears to be destroyed abruptly and never returns as a palace centre. Mycenae, however, experiences multiple episodes of damage and continued occupation. Tyre survives into the post-palatial period, though transformed. Athens appears to avoid the kind of catastrophic destruction seen elsewhere, and some smaller communities actually grow as people relocate. There is therefore no single Mycenaean experience of collapse. Migration is nevertheless real. Population movements are visible in changing settlement patterns and material culture across parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Groups from disrupted regions may have become raiders, mercenaries, refugees, colonists, or all of these at different moments. Categories that seem separate in modern language can overlap in times of collapse. A community fleeing drought or political violence can arrive elsewhere as desperate migrants. If denied access to land or resources, the same people may become armed attackers. Soldiers formerly employed by a palace that no longer exists may join mobile bands. Maritime raiding can become both survival strategy and opportunity. This is one reason the search for a single ethnic identity behind the sea peoples is misleading. The wider crisis may have produced mobile populations rather than been caused entirely by them. Some groups blamed for destruction could themselves be victims of earlier collapses elsewhere. Environmental evidence strengthens this possibility. Paleoclimate records from portions of the eastern Mediterranean suggest episodes of increased aridity around the end of the Bronze Age. A few poor harvests can be managed through storage and redistribution, particularly by powerful palace states. Longer or repeated droughts create deeper problems. Grain surpluses decline, livestock suffer, food becomes more expensive, people leave marginal lands. Rulers face greater demands while receiving fewer resources. Political legitimacy can erode when institutions built partly around redistribution cannot provide security during scarcity. No climate record, however, demonstrates that all Aegean kingdoms experience identical drought conditions at the same moment. Environmental effects are regional. A dry period devastating one area may be manageable in another. Climate therefore works best as part of a broader explanation rather than a universal trigger. Earthquakes present a similar pattern. The Aegean is one of Europe's most seismically active regions. Major earthquakes certainly strike Bronze Age settlements. Buildings designed with timber reinforcement suggest that inhabitants understand the danger well. Some destruction layers around the period of collapse contain architectural damage compatible with seismic events. Yet earthquakes had struck these societies before, and they had rebuilt. The more important question is why recovery becomes harder around 1200 BCE. That question leads back to the palace economy itself. The Mycenaean kingdoms are powerful because they coordinate specialists and resources across large territories, but this efficiency comes at a cost. A bronze industry depends on imported copper and tin. Textile workshops depend on centrally managed wool. Officials depend on scribes and administrative centres. Elite warfare depends on horses, chariots, armour, craftsmen, and food surplus, if several links fail at once. The system cannot easily simplify without losing the institutions that give rulers their power. Internal political conflict could accelerate the breakdown. The archaeological record rarely identifies a rebellion directly, but palatial hierarchies create obvious tensions. Local elites may resent central control. Communities required to supply goods and labour may resist increasing demands during shortages. Dynastic disputes can divide armed factions. A palace weakened by external pressure may be far more vulnerable to rivals from within its own territory. Changes in warfare may also favour smaller mobile groups over heavily organised palace forces. Bronze Age elites invest resources in chariots, fortified centres, and specialised weapons. Such systems are impressive but costly. Raiding forces operating outside palace structures may be more flexible, particularly if trade disruptions limit access to metal and horses. The exact military transformation remains debated, but the final decades of the palace world clearly involve growing insecurity. The most convincing model is therefore not one cause but a cascade. A drought reduces agricultural surplus. Food shortages increase migration. Migration intensifies competition. Warfare disrupts shipping. Trade disruption limits access to metals and luxury goods. Palace economies demand more from communities already under stress. Rebellion or political fragmentation follows. An earthquake then strikes a center without the resources to rebuild. Refugees become raiders elsewhere. Another kingdom loses an ally, a market, and a source of imported material. What begins as several manageable crises becomes a system-wide failure. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because no single event needs to. The late Bronze Age kingdoms had survived disasters before. What they could not survive was the simultaneous weakening of the networks that allowed recovery. When the palaces burned this time, the administrators did not return to their tablets. The workshops were not reorganized on the old scale. The walls were sometimes repaired, but the political system behind them was gone. And yet the people remained. They did not disappear with the kingdoms whose names history forgot. They moved into a different world, one without the great palace bureaucracies, without linear B scribes, and without the international networks that had once made bronze, ivory, glass, and gold flow so freely across the Aegean. When the palaces disappear, the Aegean does not become empty. The collapse destroys political systems more effectively than it destroys populations. People remain in the valleys, on the islands, along the coasts, and beneath the walls of ruined citadels. They continue planting grain, keeping animals, shaping pottery, repairing houses, travelling by sea, and burying their dead. What changes is the scale and organization of the world around them. The central institutions that once counted sheep by the thousands, distributed bronze to smiths, stored agricultural surpluses, and maintained elaborate administrative hierarchies are no longer functioning. The landscape is still inhabited, but it has lost the machinery that once connected distant communities through palace authority. This post-palatial world is often described as a dark age, but the term can mislead. It is dark mainly because written records become scarce or disappear altogether. Linear B vanishes from Greece with the palace bureaucracies that used it. For several centuries, there is no comparable administrative script on the mainland. Historians therefore lose one of their richest sources just as society is undergoing profound transformation. Silence in writing can look like silence in history, even when life continues everywhere. Settlement patterns reveal both disruption and adaptation. Some major palace centres shrink dramatically. Others remain inhabited on a reduced scale. New communities appear in defensible or previously less important locations. Coastal populations shift. Certain islands become more significant, perhaps because displaced groups seek safer routes or new opportunities. Population decline seems substantial in some regions, but it is not uniform across the Aegean. The evidence remains incomplete. An abandonment at one site may reflect movement rather than death. Migration is therefore central to the story. People leaving damaged palace territories carry more than possessions. They carry language, craft knowledge, religious practices, memories, and social identities. Some groups move short distances into neighbouring valleys. Others may cross the sea. Material culture changes in places such as Cyprus, the Levant, and the Aegean have often been interpreted through migration. though matching pottery styles directly to ethnic groups is risky. Objects can move through trade or imitation as easily as people do. Even within Greece, regional differences become stronger. Without large palace administrations imposing standardized systems, local traditions become more visible. Pottery styles evolve in new directions. Burial practices change. Political authority becomes smaller in scale. Instead of a one-axe commanding a bureaucratic kingdom, communities may be led by local chiefs, warrior elites, councils, or household heads. Later Greek terminology cannot be projected backward with complete confidence, but the social structure clearly becomes less centralized. The economy also simplifies, though it does not collapse into isolation. Long-distance trade contracts sharply after 1200 BCE, especially compared with the extraordinary international networks of the previous centuries. Imported luxury goods become rarer. Bronze production is affected by disrupted access to copper and tin, yet exchange continues. Ships still cross the Aegean. Cyprus remains an important center of metalworking. Communities maintain regional trade in pottery, food, tools, and other necessities. Iron gradually becomes more prominent during this period, though the transition is neither immediate nor revolutionary. Early iron objects can be difficult to produce consistently, and bronze remains valuable. Over time, however, iron has one enormous strategic advantage. Its ores are more widely available than the ingredients required for bronze. A world with fractured long-distance trade may therefore favor a metal whose raw material can be sourced more locally. The rise of iron is partly technological, but it is also connected to changing economic geography. Craftsmanship does not disappear with palace workshops. Potters continue experimenting with shapes and decoration. Metalworkers preserve sophisticated techniques. Weavers continue producing textiles. Builders reuse old walls and erect new houses. Some skills once supported by centralized institutions survive because they remain useful at smaller scales. Others decline because the economic systems that sustained them no longer exist. One surprising example is writing itself. The disappearance of Linear B is not evidence that people suddenly become incapable of literacy. Rather, the script had been tied closely to palace administration. When the bureaucracy disappears, the social reason for maintaining a specialized scribal class also disappears. Writing is a technology, but it is also an institution. Without schools, officials, archives, and administrative demand, knowledge of a script can vanish within surprisingly few generations. Religious traditions show greater endurance. Names of gods preserved in Linear B later reappear in historical Greek religion. Certain sanctuaries remain important or are reused. Ritual practices transform, but the underlying sacred geography of mountains, caves, springs, and prominent landscapes survives. Memory is preserved not through documents, but through repeated action. A place remains sacred because people continue going there. The ruins themselves become part of this new environment. Massive citadel walls do not disappear. Tholos tombs remain visible. Abandoned palace foundations dominate certain hills. Later communities grow up beside structures they did not build and can no longer fully explain. Over generations, these ruins become evidence of a greater past. They suggest that extraordinary rulers or heroes once inhabited the landscape. This is where history begins to drift toward legend. A child growing up centuries after the fall of Mycenae can still see the enormous stones of its walls. No written archive explains who built them. The builders' names are gone. The administrative language is forgotten. yet the architecture remains too impressive to ignore. Stories fill the silence. Great kings once lived here. Heroes ruled these halls. Giants built these walls. Armies sailed from these shores. Oral tradition can carry fragments of real memory through periods without writing. Names may survive. Places may preserve associations with rulers or wars. Genealogies can connect local elites to heroic ancestors. But oral memory is not static storage. Every generation retells stories according to its own political needs, social values, and imagination. Events merge, chronologies compress, characters become larger than life. This process helps explain why the collapse does not erase the Bronze Age completely. The palace system disappears, but memories of a palace world may survive in distorted form. Later Greek epic poetry contains echoes of a society ruled by powerful kings, obsessed with honor, warfare, feasting, gift exchange, and inherited status. Some objects and practices described in epic appear to belong to different historical periods, showing that the tradition has accumulated layers over centuries. Yet certain details seem strikingly old. The boar's tusk helmet is a famous example. Homeric poetry describes a helmet constructed using boar tusks, an object known archaeologically from the Mycenaean Bronze Age, but no longer typical in the period when the epics reach written form. Such details suggest that oral tradition can preserve fragments from a vanished material world, even as the larger story changes around them. The collapse, therefore, does something paradoxical. It destroys the institutions capable of recording history while creating the conditions in which memory becomes myth. The kingdoms lose their archives, but their ruins remain visible. Their kings lose their names, but heroic figures take their place. Their wars lose their precise causes, but tales of great expeditions survive. By the 8th century BCE, writing returns to Greece in a new form, adapted from the Phoenician alphabet. The society using it is very different from the palace kingdoms of the Bronze Age. Yet when Greeks begin writing down epic traditions, they look backward toward an age of powerful rulers, wealthy citadels, distant voyages, and catastrophic wars. The forgotten kingdoms have begun to return, not as history yet, but as legend. Centuries after the palace fires have gone cold, the Aegean still carries the shape of the vanished kingdoms. Their bureaucracies are gone, their scribes have disappeared, and their rulers survive only indirectly, but the landscape refuses to forget them. At Mycenae, enormous walls continue to rise above the Argolid. At Tiryns, corridors built inside Cyclopean masonry remain embedded in the hill across Crete. The ruins of Knossos and other palace centres slowly become part of a different cultural world. On Thera, an entire town remains sealed beneath volcanic deposits. Troy is rebuilt repeatedly on the same strategic ground. The political systems that once connected these places are dead, yet their physical remains continue to influence the generations that inherit them. By the early first millennium BCE, communities throughout Greece are developing new political forms. Small settlements grow into larger centres. Regional elites compete for status. Maritime trade begins to expand again. Iron becomes increasingly common. Contacts with Cyprus, the Levant, and Phoenician traders help reconnect Greece with wider Mediterranean networks. Then, during the 8th century BCE, writing returns. Not through the revival of Linear B, but through the adoption and adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet. The transformation is profound. A technology that had once belonged largely to palace accountants now becomes capable of recording poetry, dedications, laws, ownership marks, and eventually historical inquiry. When Greeks begin writing down the great epic traditions associated with Homer, they're looking backward toward an age that is already remote. Their world contains no Mycenaean palace bureaucracy, no linear bee scribes, and no wanacs controlling thousands of sheep through administrative tablets. Yet the stories describe powerful kings ruling from wealthy centres, armies sailing across the Aegean, bronze weapons, elaborate feasts, great gifts, fortified cities, and dynasties destroyed through war and rivalry. The correspondence is imperfect but difficult to dismiss entirely. Some details clearly reflect later periods, others seem to preserve much older traditions. The result is not a historical archive but a layered cultural memory. The Bronze Age survives through fragments that have been rearranged by centuries of oral transmission. This may explain why places such as Mycenae remain attached to famous heroic names: Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, Orestes, Menelaus, and other figures belong to traditions composed into forms far later than the actual palace period. Archaeology cannot prove that individuals matching these characters existed, yet the locations associated with them are often genuinely important Bronze Age centres. The storytellers remember where power had once been concentrated even after they no longer remember exactly how that power worked. Troy presents the same strange overlap. A real fortified settlement in northwestern Anatolia becomes the setting for the most famous war in Greek epic. Hittite records indicate political conflict involving western Anatolia and a power plausibly associated with Mycenaean Greeks. Archaeology reveals late Bronze Age destruction. None of this proves the Iliad as literal history, but it shows that the legends emerge from a geography in which real Bronze Age rivalry once took place. Crete undergoes an even more remarkable transformation in memory. The society responsible for linear A, palace complexes, elaborate frescoes, and wide maritime influence becomes associated in later Greek tradition with King Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, and extraordinary craftsmen such as Daedalus. These stories cannot be treated as straightforward recollections of Minoan history, yet they preserve a cultural impression of Crete as a place of ancient power, complex buildings, maritime authority, ritual danger, and technological sophistication. The labyrinth is a particularly revealing example. The palace at Knossos is not literally a mythological maze designed to imprison a monster, but its layered corridors, courts, staircases, magazines, and repeated rebuilding would have appeared extraordinary to later observers encountering ruins whose original functions were forgotten. A place can lose its history while retaining an atmosphere powerful enough to generate new stories. Modern archaeology begins reversing that process in the 19th and 20th centuries. Excavators uncover Mycenaean shaft graves, Cretan palaces, Cycladic cemeteries, Akrotiri's buried houses, and Troy's layered fortifications. Scripts are discovered. Linear B is eventually deciphered. Entire cultural periods that had been known largely through legend acquire dates, economic systems, architecture, trade routes, and administrative structures. Yet archaeology also reveals how much has been permanently lost. Linear A remains undeciphered. The political organization of Minoan Crete remains debated. The identities of many Cycladic communities are unknown. The exact relationship between Mycenaean states and the Hittite Ahiawa remains incomplete. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse continue to resist one explanation. Even Linear B, for all its importance, tells historians almost nothing about personal emotions, political arguments, myths, or the thoughts of ordinary people. What survives is uneven because preservation is never neutral. A palace fire destroys a kingdom but preserves its tablets. A volcanic eruption ends a town but saves its paintings. A grave protects gold while the wooden house of a farmer disappears. Stone walls survive while songs vanish unless generations continue singing them. Archaeology therefore reconstructs the past from what catastrophe, burial, geology, and chance permit to remain. That unevenness is perhaps the central mystery of the forgotten Aegean kingdoms. They were never truly forgotten in every sense. Their ruins remained visible. Their place names survived. Some gods endured. Certain stories crossed the centuries. Maritime routes continued to connect familiar islands. Later Greeks lived among physical traces of a past they could no longer explain accurately. And modern discovery has not restored that world completely. It has instead made the missing portions easier to see. The Aegean of the Bronze Age was not one civilization rising and falling in isolation. It was a chain of overlapping worlds, Cycladic sailors crossing between small islands, Minoan administrators filling palace magazines, Akrotiri families living beneath painted walls, Mycenaean rulers directing armies and workshops, merchants carrying copper across dangerous seas, Anatolian kings watching Western rivals, and communities trying to survive as the international system around them fractured. Each kingdom believed, implicitly or explicitly, in its own continuity. Walls were constructed for future generations. Tombs were built to preserve dynasties. Palaces were expanded rather than abandoned. Records were written because administrators expected tomorrow's work to resemble today's. Then tomorrow changed. The kingdoms vanished, but the Aegean remained, carrying their harbours, ruins, buried streets, broken tablets, and stories into a new age. The Winddown begins not with another destruction, but with the sea. It is still there between the islands, moving through the same channels that carried obsidian traders thousands of years ago and palace ships during the height of the Bronze Age. The hills remain above Mycenae. Crete still faces south toward Egypt. The cliffs of Thera still rise above the caldera, though the shoreline bears the scars of an eruption whose witnesses disappeared long before anyone could write their names. Civilizations often seem permanent from inside themselves. Their institutions develop routines. Their officials count resources. Their builders raise walls intended to endure. Ships follow familiar routes, and children grow up assuming that the world of their parents will continue around them. The forgotten kingdoms of the Aegean remind us how easily that confidence can be mistaken for permanence. Yet disappearance is rarely complete. A script may become unreadable, while the clay carrying it survives. A palace may collapse, while a god's name crosses the centuries. A town may empty, while painted walls remain beneath ash. A ruler may be forgotten, while stories of kings continue gathering round the ruins where people once ruled. The Aegean preserves its past in fragments because fragments are often all time allows to survive. Archaeologists recover them carefully, knowing that every answer tends to expose another absence. A broken vessel can reveal a trade route. A tablet can reveal a bureaucracy. A layer of ash can reveal the moment a city stopped living. But no excavation can fully restore the voices that once filled these places. Perhaps that is why the forgotten kingdoms remain so compelling. They sit somewhere between history and silence, close enough to be reconstructed but distant enough to resist completion. Across the darkening water, islands become silhouettes. Somewhere beyond them lie buried houses, collapsed citadels, forgotten harbours, and roads that once led toward rulers whose names are gone. The ships that connected their world no longer sail. The palaces no longer open their storerooms. The scribes no longer press signs into wet clay. Only the landscape remains, holding the outlines of a civilization that believed it was building for the future, and became instead one of the deepest memories of the ancient sea.